The sun was setting on what had been an unseasonably warm autumn day as I stood at the edge of the small airfield, watching the shadows stretch across the tarmac. The sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, a picturesque ending that belied the heavy weight in my chest. The air was thick, laden with the scent of impending rain and the faint exhaust from the nearby jets. I had been summoned hastily to this secluded location, where the ordinary hum of everyday life was muffled by a pervasive silence. My name is Jonathan Kane, and I have served as an exorcist for the better part of 2 decades. Though my services have taken me to many corners of the globe, each call still comes with an unsettling uncertainty. I had been contacted by the Knights of St. Michael, an ancient order, to accompany a private plane to Rome. The details of the mission were sketchy, but the urgency in their voice spoke volumes. I had learned to trust their instincts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I was greeted by Thomas, a fellow knight and the only other passenger on this peculiar journey. Thomas was a man of few words, his stoic demeanor a mask crafted by years of service. We exchanged nods of recognition, both aware that our shared silence was filled with the understanding of what lay ahead. Though the specifics were unknown, the nature of our mission was clear. We were to aid in a non-traditional exorcism, one that required our immediate attention. The plane, a sleek private jet, was an incongruous sight against the backdrop of the rural airfield. As we boarded, the inside revealed an unstated luxury. Leather seats and polished wood gleamed under the soft cabin lights. Yet despite the comfort, there was an undeniable tension that seemed to cling to the air. The flight began smoothly, the hum of the engines a low lullaby that contrasted sharply with my racing thoughts. Thomas sat across from me, his eyes closed in what I assumed was a meditative state. I envied his calm. My mind, however, was a cacophony of questions, each demanding attention. Who was our charge? What sort of possession warranted such secrecy and speed? It wasn't long before the first disturbance made itself known. A flicker of lights above, a brief static crackle through the intercom, easily dismissed by those unaccustomed to the signs. But I knew better. These were the whispers of something sinister, the first strains of a malevolent presence. I glanced at Thomas, whose eyes were now open, meeting mine with a knowing glance. He had sensed it too. Our charge, a young woman named Margaret, was seated at the back of the plane, accompanied by 2 attendants. Her face was pale, drawn into an expression of serene detachment that seemed eerily at odds with the chaos brewing around her. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. A flicker of something ancient and knowing lurked within their depths. Thomas and I approached, our steps synchronized by a shared purpose. Margaret's gaze followed us, unblinking, as if appraising her would-be liberators. I felt a chill creep along my spine, a coldness that defied the cabin's warmth. This was no ordinary possession. As I began to speak, introducing ourselves and explaining our purpose, Margaret's lips curled into a smile, one that was far too knowing, too mocking. "You think you can save me?" she asked, her voice a low guttural tone that seemed to echo within the confines of the jet. "I have no need of saving." There was a confidence in her voice that unnerved me. This was a being that had settled comfortably within its host, one that was not easily dislodged. Thomas and I exchanged a glance, and without needing words, we began the rite. As the Latin prayers filled the cabin, Margaret laughed, a sound that reverberated with an unnatural echo. I steeled myself, focusing on the words, drawing strength from a faith honed over many years. Her laughter faded, replaced by a low growl that seemed to resonate from deep within. Hours passed, The battle of wills taking its toll on all present. The plane seemed to react to the turbulence of our spiritual struggle. The lights flickered sporadically, and the engines groaned with an unsettling cadence. I could feel the presence within Margaret fighting back, pushing against our efforts with a ferocity I had rarely encountered. As the night wore on, the struggle escalated. The cabin temperature plummeted, our breaths visible in the chilled air. Margaret thrashed against her restraints, her eyes burning with a fire that seemed almost luminescent in the dim light. The attendants, despite their training, looked on with a mixture of fear and awe. It was then that Margaret's voice changed once more, adopting a tone that was both pleading and commanding. "Release me," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "You do not understand what I am becoming." Her words struck a chord within me. This was no ordinary possession, no mere infestation of evil. There was something deeper at play, something I had yet to comprehend. As the realization dawned, the plane shuddered violently, an unseen force tugging at its very fabric. Alarmed, I intensified my efforts, drawing on all the training and faith I possessed. Thomas, too, was engaged in a battle of his own, his voice rising above the cacophony as he called upon the protection of St. Michael. His presence was a beacon, a guiding light in the midst of the storm. Together, we pressed on, our voices merging in a symphony of defiance. The climax came without warning. Margaret's body arched, her eyes wide and unseeing, as a guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound that seemed to transcend the physical world. It was a scream of anguish, of defiance, and finally, of release. The cabin lights flared, bathing us in an unearthly glow, and then, just as suddenly, everything was silent. Margaret slumped forward, her body limp and unresponsive. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and as I gently lifted her chin, I saw her eyes flutter open. They were clear now, free of the malevolent presence that had consumed her. Relief washed over me, tempered by the fatigue that seeped into my bones. Thomas and I exchanged a weary nod, our mission accomplished. Yet, as the plane continued its journey through the night sky, a lingering unease remained. Though Margaret had been freed, there was a sense that the battle was far from over. Her words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had been momentarily held at bay. "You do not understand what I am becoming." As we approached our destination, the horizon began to lighten, casting the world in shades of gray. It was a new day, yet the shadows of the night clung stubbornly to my thoughts. I had been trained to understand the nature of evil, to confront it and banish it. But this encounter had left me with more questions than answers. The Knights of St. Michael would undoubtedly seek to understand the nature of what we had faced, and though our immediate task was complete, I knew that I would not find peace until I unraveled the mystery of Margaret's possession. The plane landed smoothly, the thrill of the ground beneath the wheels a welcome sensation. As we disembarked, Margaret was escorted away by a team of specialists, her future uncertain, yet hopeful. Thomas and I remained on the tarmac, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in soft pastels. As we parted ways, I felt the weight of a promise unspoken yet understood. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. The shadows had retreated, for now, but they lingered at the edges of my consciousness. A reminder that evil never truly sleeps. With a final nod to Thomas, I turned away, the echo of Margaret's voice still haunting the periphery of my thoughts. In the calm of the morning, I found myself reflecting on the encounter, the eerie serenity offering a stark contrast to the turmoil of the night before. The plane climbed back into the skies, carrying with it the echoes of a struggle that would linger long after the engines had faded into the distance. I had always thought that the Vatican, with its grand halls and sacred aura, would be a place of peace, a sanctuary far removed from the banalities of everyday evil. But the truth, as I came to learn, was more complex, a woven tapestry of light and shadow. My journey into this labyrinth of faith and fear began when I was accepted as an exorcist in training, a role that promised to test not only my faith, but also the very core of my sanity. Under the guidance of Father Ambrose, a seasoned exorcist with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of countless unsolved mysteries, I embarked on this path with a mix of trepidation and eager anticipation. Father Ambrose was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had peered into the abyss and returned with a sliver of its darkness embedded in his soul. The training commenced with long hours in the Vatican Library, a place where the air was thick with the scent of ancient parchment and wisdom. Here, I pored over texts that chronicled the history of exorcism, the dogma surrounding it, and the testimonies of those who had faced the darkness. These readings, interspersed with Father Ambrose's occasional anecdotes, painted a picture of a world where the supernatural was always lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness. My days followed a rhythmic cadence. Mornings were spent in study, afternoons in prayer, and evenings in reflection. Yet, beneath this veneer of routine, an undercurrent of unease began to flow. I often felt as though unseen eyes watched me from the dim corners of the library, shadows flickering just beyond the periphery of my vision. I dismissed these feelings as symptoms of an overactive imagination, fueled by the stories I read and the hushed whispers of the past. It was during one of these uneventful days that I experienced the first disturbance. Father Ambrose had taken me into the ancient sections beneath the Apostolic Palace, a network of catacombs that, unbeknownst to many, housed some of the Vatican's most guarded secrets. These passages, cold and damp, were illuminated by the flickering flames of our lanterns, casting ghostly silhouettes on the walls. As we walked, Father Ambrose spoke of the spiritual battlegrounds that these catacombs represented, where exorcists of old had faced entities beyond human comprehension. His voice echoed in the confined space, the sound waves bouncing off the stone walls as if they carried the voices of those long gone. It was here that I felt it, a soft yet insistent whisper, rushing against my consciousness like a tendril of smoke. Its words were unintelligible, yet the tone was unmistakable, taunting, inviting, threatening. I halted abruptly, clutching the lantern tighter, its metal handle biting into my palm. Father Ambrose stopped too, his gaze piercing through the dim light. "Do you hear them?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with a knowing grimness. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Good," he replied, "for that is the first lesson, recognizing their presence." The days that followed were marked by an escalation of these disturbances. The whispers grew more frequent, more coherent, weaving themselves into my thoughts with an unsettling familiarity. They seemed to know my fears, my doubts, and exploited them with precision. At night, I dreamt of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. I awoke, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in time with the lingering echoes of their laughter. Father Ambrose remained a steadfast guide through these turbulent times. His teachings took on a new dimension as he instructed me in the rites of exorcism, the solemn prayers, and the significance of each sacred gesture. His presence was a bulwark against the encroaching shadows, yet I sensed an unspoken urgency in his demeanor, as though he knew that a storm was brewing, one that would test the limits of my training. The climax came unexpectedly, a tempest that shattered the fragile equilibrium I had clung to. We were deep within the labyrinth of catacombs, preparing for a ritual to cleanse a particularly troubled section. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence heavy with the weight of countless unspoken fears. As Father Ambrose began the incantations, the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, converging towards us with an almost predatory intent. The lantern light flickered, casting a gloom that seemed to breathe, to expand and contract. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. A grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, a nightmarish embodiment of malevolence. It hovered before us, its form shifting and writhing as though it were a living nightmare. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Father Ambrose stood firm, his voice rising above the din, a beacon of clarity amidst the chaos. I joined him in the incantations, my voice trembling but steady, each word a shield against the onslaught of darkness. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, its visage twisting into a mask of rage. For what felt like an eternity, we stood locked in a battle of wills, the air crackling with a tension that seemed to warp reality itself. And then, with a final piercing scream, the entity dissipated, its essence scattered like ash in the wind. Silence descended, profound and absolute, the echoes of the struggle lingering in the air. In the aftermath, as the adrenaline waned, I felt a profound sense of emptiness, as though the very fabric of my being had been unraveled and stitched back together. Father Ambrose placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and sorrow. "You did well," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet, despite the victory, a lingering fear clung to me, a shadow that refused to be dispelled. The encounter had left its mark, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the veil of our perception. In the days that followed, I found myself questioning the boundaries between reality and the supernatural, the thin line that separated faith from madness. As I continued my training, this fear became a constant companion, a specter that loomed at the edges of my consciousness. It was a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the ease with which it could be swayed by forces beyond comprehension. The Vatican, with its walls steeped in history and holiness, became both a sanctuary and a prison. A place where the past and present collided in a dance of light and shadow. The ghosts of those who had walked these halls before me were ever present, their stories etched into the very stones beneath my feet. Each day, I carried the knowledge of what I had faced, the memory of that entity a constant presence in my thoughts. It was a burden, but also a gift, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unrelenting darkness. I had peered into the abyss and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger for the experience. In quiet moments, when the whispers of the past grew loud, I found solace in the teachings of Father Ambrose, in the rituals and prayers that had withstood the test of time. They were my anchor, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the soul, there exists a flicker of light, a spark of hope that can never be extinguished. The path I had chosen was fraught with peril, but it was mine alone to walk. And as I journeyed deeper into the heart of the Vatican, I knew that I would face many more demons, both within and without. But I also knew that I was not alone, that the strength of those who had come before me would guide my steps, their legacy a beacon in the encroaching night.
My childhood home stood resolutely at the end of a narrow lane, its facade a tapestry of creeping ivy and weathered brick. It had been in my family for generations, a testament to our enduring presence in this small, insular village. The walls, I was told, held stories of those who had come before me, their voices echoing through the corridors in whispers and sighs. To me, it was simply home. The creaking floorboards and drafty windows were as familiar as my own heartbeat, a constant melody in the background of my life. The story of our family's legacy was one I had heard countless times, a tale woven into the fabric of our existence. It was said that we were descended from those who had once hunted witches, witchfinder generals with a divine mandate to cleanse the land of dark magic. Growing up, I thought of these ancestors as distant shadows, their deeds exaggerated by time and retelling. My father, the keeper of our family's history, spoke of them with a mixture of reverence and caution, instilling in me both pride and a vague unease. Life proceeded with a comforting monotony, each day blending seamlessly into the next. The villagers were a close-knit community, bound by shared histories and unspoken understandings. They treated us with a kind of weary respect, conscious of the power that our names still carried. My father, a man of stern demeanor and taciturn nature, was a fixture in the village, as was the ancestral home we inhabited. It was during one unremarkable autumn afternoon that the first stirrings of disturbance made themselves known. I was in the attic, sorting through boxes of forgotten relics, when I stumbled upon a peculiar object tucked away in a dusty corner. It was a small, wooden box, ornately carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Inside, nestled among layers of faded velvet, was a journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with a spidery script that was both alien and familiar. The journal belonged to one of my ancestors, a prominent witchfinder general whose name had been largely lost to the passage of time. As I began to read, a chill settled over me, the room growing colder with each turn of the page. The entries spoke of terrible secrets, of a pact forged in blood and shadow, a legacy of power that had been passed down through our family line. The words seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy, resonating in the silent confines of the attic. Disturbed, I closed the journal and returned it to its resting place, but the unease lingered, seeping into my thoughts like a dark fog. That night, sleep eluded me, my dreams haunted by indistinct figures and whispered incantations. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest, the room suffused with an oppressive stillness. The shadows seemed to twist and sway, forming shapes that danced just beyond the edge of perception. As days turned to weeks, the feeling of disquiet only grew stronger, a constant presence that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. My father, who had always been my anchor in times of uncertainty, seemed oblivious to the changes taking place. He carried on with his daily routines, his expression as inscrutable as ever. I, on the other hand, felt increasingly like a stranger in my own skin, besieged by a legacy I had never truly understood. The escalation was subtle at first, a creeping sense of dread that gradually spiraled into something more tangible. It began with small incidents, objects misplaced, doors that swung open of their own accord, the faint odor of smoke lingering in rooms where no fire had burned. Each occurrence was easily dismissed on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. One evening, as I sat alone in the library, the shadows seemed to deepen, pooling around the edges of the room like ink. I sensed a presence, something ancient and watchful, lurking just beyond the limits of sight. The air grew thick, charged with an electric tension that prickled along my skin. I forced myself to remain calm, rationalizing that it was merely my imagination, spurred on by the journal and my own growing anxiety. But the disturbances persisted, each one more unsettling than the last. Doors rattled in their frames, voices murmured in the dead of night, and the house itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own. I confided in my father, hoping for some reassurance, but his reaction was not what I expected. His expression darkened, and he warned me to leave the past alone, to forget the journal and its troubling contents. Despite his warning, I felt compelled to delve deeper, driven by a need to understand the truth of our family's legacy. I spent hours in the library, poring over old texts and reports, piecing together the fragments of our history. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying, a lineage steeped in power and blood, bound by a covenant forged in the name of God and duty. It was during this time that I began to notice changes in myself, subtle shifts that I could not explain. My senses seemed heightened, attuned to the ebb and flow of unseen forces. I found myself drawn to the symbols and rituals described in the journal, their meanings unlocking something within me, a dormant knowledge that had lain buried for generations. The climax came on a stormy night, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. I was in the attic once more, the journal open before me, when a sudden gust extinguished the candle, plunging the room into darkness. The shadows writhed and coalesced, taking on the shape of a man, his features obscured and indistinct. It was him, the Witchfinder General, his presence a palpable weight in the air. He spoke to me then, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the bones of the house. He spoke of duty and sacrifice, of a power that lay dormant in our blood, waiting to be awakened. He bid me to accept my heritage, to embrace the mantle of the Witchfinder, and to continue the work that had begun centuries before. Trembling, I listened, torn between fear and a strange exhilaration. The shadows pressed closer, enfolding me in their cold embrace, as if urging me toward a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. And in that moment, I understood the true nature of our legacy, a gift and a curse, intertwined and inseparable. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and shining in the early light. The house stood silent, its secrets once again hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy. Yet I could feel the change within me, a new awareness that thrummed beneath my skin like a second heartbeat. The legacy of the Witchfinder Generals was mine to bear, a burden I had not chosen but could no longer deny. Though the disturbances ceased, the fear lingered, a shadow that stretched across my days. The villagers, with their knowing glances and hushed conversations, seemed somehow distant, as if they sensed the shift that had taken place. My father, too, regarded me with a mixture of pride and sorrow, as if recognizing the inevitability of my fate. I spent long hours in contemplation, grappling with the weight of my newfound knowledge. The journal remained locked away, a reminder of the path I had chosen, its pages etched into my memory with a clarity that was both haunting and profound. I understood now the legacy of the god slaves, the price that must be paid for wielding such power. And so, life continued, each day a careful dance between the past and the present. The house, with its creaking floorboards and echoing halls, remained a constant companion, its secrets whispering to me in the quiet moments of the night. I had become the guardian of our family's legacy, the latest in a long line of witchfinders, bound by blood and duty to a covenant that was both blessing and curse. I knew that one day the cycle would begin again, that the shadows would rise and I would be called upon to fulfill my role. Until then, I would watch and wait, vigilant and aware, the weight of history resting heavily upon my shoulders. The legacy of the Witchfinder Generals was mine to uphold, a burden I carried with both dread and a curious kind of honor. In the end, perhaps that was the true inheritance of the god slaves, a legacy of power and fear, forever entwined in the fabric of our lives.
I had often found myself reflecting on the peculiarities of fate as I conducted my daily tasks within the thick, oppressive walls of the southern Arizona penitentiary. The desert sun beat relentlessly upon the roof of the prison, a merciless sentinel that watched over both the guilty and the innocent. The penitentiary was a world unto itself, a place where time seemed to stretch and contract in a manner that defied the logic of the outside. My duties as one of the few counselors in the prison required a calm demeanor, a steady hand, and above all, a firm grasp on reality. Qualities I had always believed I possessed in abundance. The days there began with the predictability of a metronome. I would arrive at the penitentiary just as the sun began its ascent over the dusty horizon, casting long shadows that reached out like fingers across the barren landscape. The desert was a sight both beautiful and foreboding, its stark beauty marred by the knowledge of the suffering that took place within the walls I was about to enter. I walked through the iron gates, nodded to the guards, and made my way to the small, claustrophobic office that served as my sanctuary from the chaos of the prison. Inmates came and went from my office with regularity, each one bringing a unique story of crime, regret, or defiance. I listened with practiced patience, offering what counsel I could, though it often felt like casting pebbles into a vast troubled sea. It was, however, a life I understood. A world where every action had an explanation, every story a beginning and an end. At least, that was what I believed until the day the disturbances began. It started with whispers, soft, indistinct, like the rustle of the desert wind through the sparse vegetation. Prisoners would speak of a presence, something that watched them from the shadows of their cells and the dimly lit corridors. At first, I dismissed these tales as the product of overactive imaginations, perhaps a means of coping with the monotony and fear that permeated the prison. Yet, as the days passed, the whispers grew in intensity, taking on a life of their own. The stories were consistent, each inmate recounting sightings of a shadowy figure that seemed to drift just beyond the edge of their vision. Initially, I attributed these stories to the legend of the Skinwalker, a tale I had heard many times during my years in Arizona. According to the myth, a Skinwalker was a witch or shaman capable of transforming into animals or humans at will, a creature that thrived on fear and chaos. The legend was deeply rooted in Native American folklore, a terrifying echo of the elemental forces that shaped the desert landscape. The stories seemed an unlikely fit for the sterile corridors and regimented routines of the penitentiary, yet they persisted, whispered in tones that carried an edge of genuine terror. As the whispers grew, disturbances followed. Guards reported strange sounds echoing through the corridors during the night, the scrape of claws on concrete, the low growl of something inhuman. Surveillance cameras intended to capture every corner of the facility flickered and failed unpredictably, shrouding certain areas in darkness at crucial moments. It was as if the prison itself was conspiring to hide something from view, to shelter an unseen presence that moved with impunity through the halls. My skepticism began to waver when I encountered the first tangible evidence of something amiss. My office, a place I had come to regard as safe and familiar, was altered in subtle, disquieting ways. Papers that I had left in orderly piles were scattered across the floor. Drawers that I had locked were found open, their contents rummaged through. It was as if someone or something was searching for something within the confines of my small domain. An unseen force that left no traces but the disarray it created. Then there were the nights, when the oppressive heat of the day gave way to the chill of the desert air. I found myself waking in the early hours, a sense of unease pressing down upon me with an intensity that defied explanation. I would lie in bed, listening to the silence, aware of a presence that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of perception. It was a feeling I could not shake, a sensation that grew stronger with each passing night. The climax of these disturbances came unexpectedly during a routine counseling session with an inmate named Carlos. Carlos was a man I had come to know well, a long-term resident of the penitentiary whose crimes were as unremarkable as his demeanor. He was a quiet man, prone to introspection, a quality that had often made our sessions more reflective than most. On that particular day, however, Carlos was agitated. His usual calm replaced by an anxiety that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. "They say the skinwalker's real," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "I've seen it. It comes at night, lurking in the shadows. It's looking for something. Someone." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, a sensation that was as unwelcome as it was irrational. "Carlos," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "you know the skinwalker is just a legend, a story to scare children." He shook his head, his eyes wide with a fear that was palpable. "No, it's real. You don't understand. It can change, become anyone. It walks among us." His words echoed in my mind long after our session ended, haunting me as I went about my duty. It was as if Carlos had opened a door to a world I'd never wanted to enter, a place where reality and myth intertwined in ways that defied comprehension. That night, as I lay in bed, the presence returned. It was stronger than before, a suffocating weight that pressed down upon me, holding me captive in my own mind. I could feel it watching me, a shadowy figure that lingered beyond the curtain of sleep. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless drumbeat that matched the rhythm of my own rising panic. For the first time, I understood the depth of the fear that had gripped the inmates, the terror that had driven Carlos to speak of things best left unsaid. The following day, I awoke with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I moved through the routine of the morning with mechanical precision, my mind occupied with thoughts of the skinwalker. As I walked the corridors, the whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent until they were a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm my senses. It was in the prison yard that the terror reached its apex. I stood by the fence, watching the inmates go about their daily exercise, when I saw it, a figure standing among them, a shadow that seemed to flicker and shift, its form both solid and insubstantial. It was there for only a moment, a fleeting glimpse that defied logic, but in that instant I understood the truth. The skinwalker was real, a creature of nightmare that had slipped into the world of the waking, a presence that had invaded the sanctity of the penitentiary. The realization left me frozen, my mind grappling with the implications of what I had seen. I turned away, forcing myself to return to the shelter of my office, seeking refuge from the horror that had taken root in my mind. Yet, even there, I could not escape the presence that haunted me. The disarray that greeted me was more pronounced than ever. Papers scattered like fallen leaves, the drawers yanked open, their contents strewn about with reckless abandon. As the days turned into weeks, the presence grew stronger, an ever-present shadow that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. I found myself questioning everything I believed, the line between reality and legend blurring until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. The whispers continued, the tales of the skinwalker gaining traction with an unsettling ease, until it seemed that the entire penitentiary was held in thrall to the creature that moved among us. The fear lingered long after the sightings ceased, a quiet dread that settled into the bones of the prison like a persistent chill. I could sense it in the eyes of the inmates, in the tense, watchful demeanor of the guards, in the very air that seemed to vibrate with the memory of what had come to pass. Even as the days resumed their relentless march, the presence remained, a shadow that would not be banished by the light of reason. In the months that followed, I found myself drawn to the legend of the skinwalker, seeking answers in the folklore of the desert that surrounded us. Yet, despite my efforts, the truth remained elusive, a mystery that defied all attempts at resolution. The presence was gone, yet the fear it had instilled lingered. a reminder of the boundaries that had been crossed, the veil that had been pierced. The penitentiary returned to its familiar rhythm. The daily routines resumed with a semblance of normalcy. Yet I knew that things would never be the same. The legend of the Skinwalker had left its mark upon the prison, an indelible reminder that there were forces in this world that could not be contained by walls or bars. As I continued my work, the presence was never far from my thoughts, a shadow that watched from the periphery, a guardian of secrets that would not be easily forgotten. And so I carried on, my resolve tempered by the knowledge of what lay beyond the boundaries of the known. The Skinwalker had left its mark upon me, a lingering fear that served as a constant reminder of the unseen forces that move through the world. I had become a part of the legend, a keeper of its stories, a witness to the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of the everyday. The shadows remained, a testament to the darkness that coexisted with the light, an enduring reminder of the mysteries that would forever haunt the Southern Arizona Penitentiary.
I began my tenure as a correctional officer at the West Hollow Correctional Facility with a sense of duty and a commitment to uphold justice. Nestled amidst a dense forest in the Midwest, the prison was a relic from the early 20th century, its high brick walls and iron-barred windows standing like a stern reminder of retribution. The facility housed both the innocuous and the infamous, coiled together in a place that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. On my initial days, I found myself observing the predictable monotony of prison life. The clang of metal doors, the echo of distant voices, and the rhythmic shuffling of feet became the soundtrack to my work. There was a peculiar harmony in the routine that belied the underlying tension of confinement. My colleagues were seasoned, each carrying their own tales of the inmates, tales of redemption, tales of despair, tales that solidified the thin line between humanity and its darker inclinations. One inmate caught my attention more than others, a man named Calloway. He was a middle-aged convict with striking white hair, a wiry frame, and eyes that simmered with an intensity that was both unsettling and deeply intriguing. He was incarcerated for an arson attack that had claimed several lives, a crime he never admitted to committing. Other officers gave him a wide berth, whispering about the strangeness that surrounded him. At first, Calloway seemed like another element of prison folklore, one that I could choose to ignore. But then, peculiar occurrences began to punctuate the facility's routine. It started subtly, a missing set of keys, a flickering light, but soon escalated into something more disquieting. Every night, just after the lights were dimmed, a low, haunting hum resonated through the halls, a sound that seemed to seep through the very walls of the prison. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but once heard, impossible to ignore. I found myself drawn to Calloway, as if an invisible thread pulled me toward his cell. During my rounds, I would pause, looking through the thick bars to find him staring out of his window, eyes fixed on the sky. His behavior, though peculiar, became increasingly concerning. He started speaking of a presence, an entity that watched over him, whispering secrets that filled his nights with dread. At first, I dismissed his claims as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, another prisoner driven to paranoia by isolation. Yet, the more I listened, the more cohesive his narrative became. He spoke of a malevolent force, something beyond comprehension, that hovered just out of sight, hidden in the skies above. It was a presence that made the air feel heavier, the shadows deeper, and instilled a chilling foreboding that no amount of logic could dispel. The nights grew longer, the shadows more oppressive. A sense of unease settled over the facility. Conversations among the staff turned increasingly to the strange occurrences, but no one dared to voice the unsettling possibility that something supernatural was afoot. Some of us began having vivid, unsettling dreams, waking with a start in the depth of night, drenched in sweat, the hum echoing in our minds. Calloway became more animated, his stories more elaborate. He described visions of swirling shadows and glowing eyes peering through the celestial veil. His eyes, once a vivid blue, now seemed clouded with a strange sheen, as though reflecting the cosmic horrors he claimed to witness. Then came the night when the hum crescendoed into a deafening wail, a sound so intense it seemed to rattle the prison to its very foundation. Panic spread among the inmates and staff alike, a chaotic symphony of fear and confusion. I found myself running through the maze of corridors, checking cells, trying to maintain order amidst the chaos. That night, I made my way once more to Calloway's cell, compelled by an urgency I couldn't explain. I found him standing by the window, his face a mask of serene resignation. He turned to me, his eyes reflecting flickering flashes like distant lightning in a stormy sky. "It draws closer," he murmured, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The sky is hungry." His words sent a shiver down my spine, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. Outside, the sky had taken on an unnatural hue, a swirling mass of dark clouds that seemed to pulse with an eerie luminescence. It was as though the heavens themselves were alive, watching, waiting. The following days were marked by a growing sense of dread. The hum, now a constant presence, continued to reverberate through the halls, a relentless reminder of the unseen force lurking above. Calloway's prophecies grew darker, filled with visions of impending doom. My colleagues and I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the air was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement that something beyond our understanding was at play. Despite my every attempt to rationalize the situation, I found myself increasingly drawn into Calloway's world. I spent hours with him, listening to his tales, unable to shake the feeling that there was truth hidden in his madness. He spoke of celestial alignments, of portals that opened between worlds, and of entities that hungered for the chaos and despair of human suffering. One evening, as I sat listening to him speak, a sudden flash of light illuminated the night sky. The prison was bathed in an unearthly glow, casting long shadows that danced and twisted like living things. Calloway gazed at the sky with an expression of rapture, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "It's here," he breathed, the words barely escaping his lips. In that moment, reality seemed to fracture, the world around us spinning into a kaleidoscope of surreal imagery. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to flee, to escape the oppressive weight of the presence that loomed above. But before I could move, the prison was engulfed in a blinding light, a sensation of weightlessness, as though gravity itself had been suspended. When the light finally faded, I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of Calloway's cell, disoriented and trembling. He was gone, vanished without a trace. A feeling of profound emptiness settled over me, a silence so deep it was deafening. The sky above had returned to its normal state, the stars twinkling innocently as if nothing had happened. But I could feel it, the echo of the presence that had been, a lingering sensation of being watched, scrutinized by eyes unseen. My colleagues were equally shaken, each grappling with their own understanding of what had transpired. Official reports dismissed the incident as a mere power surge, an anomaly that defied easy explanation. Yet I knew better. I had seen the truth in Calloway's eyes, felt the touch of something that lay beyond our world. The experience left an indelible mark, a haunting reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown. Night after night, I found myself looking to the sky, searching for signs of the entity that had come and gone, leaving behind only questions and an abiding sense of unease. I resigned from my position shortly after, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had taken root in my soul. The world was no longer a place of clear boundaries and rational explanations. I saw Calloway's empty cell in my mind's eye, the shadows that danced within it whispering secrets of their own. Even miles away from West Hollow, the hum sometimes finds me in the dead of night, a soft, distant echo of the malevolent presence that had once loomed so close. In those moments, I remember Calloway's final words, and the promise they held, a promise of something greater, something beyond our comprehension, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the day it might return to claim its due.
The first time I saw the prison, it loomed against a slate-gray sky, its stone walls rising like the spine of a forgotten beast. I had been transferred from a smaller, less imposing institution, a place that had been almost homely in its predictability. But this new place, it whispered of things not meant to be spoken, of shadows that clung to your skin like the damp chill that permeated every cell. It was a fortress of despair, and I had little choice but to make it my home. Life within these walls settled into a rhythm, a pattern of monotony that was both comforting and suffocating. I was given a cell on the 3rd floor with a window that faced inward, allowing me only to glimpse the unending parade of confinement. The meals were tasteless, the conversations with my fellow inmates were sparse, and the guards patrolled with the mechanical disinterest of men hardened by routine. Yet, in that sameness, I found a strange solace. My days were predictable, my nights silent save for the occasional distant clamor of unseen commotion. It was during one of these restless nights that I first heard it, a low, barely perceptible murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At first I dismissed it as the creaks and groans of an old building settling into the ground. But as the nights wore on, the murmur became more insistent, a soft, rhythmic chant that ebbed and flowed like the tides. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination, but the sound wormed its way into my thoughts, curling around my mind like a serpent, seeking purchase. It was unsettling, this forbidden whisper, and it left me feeling raw, exposed, as if some unseen force had peeled back the layers of my psyche to reveal my most vulnerable self. Then came the first disappearance. A man named Carl, a grizzled veteran of the prison system, vanished without a trace. One day he was there, grumbling over his breakfast tray, and the next he was simply gone. The guards conducted a perfunctory search, their eyes scanning the dim corridors with practiced indifference, but there was no sign of Carl, no indication of where he might have gone. The murmurs grew louder after that, their cadence shifting to one of urgency, a hiss litany of secrets just beyond comprehension. I could hear them even during the day now, a constant background noise that buzzed at the edges of my perception. My fellow inmates seemed oblivious, their faces carved from the same stone that made up the prison walls. I wanted to ask them if they heard it too, if they could feel the vibrations in the air, but fear held my tongue. Fear of ridicule, yes, but more so the fear that acknowledging the whispers would give them power over me. As the days stretched into weeks, more men began to disappear. It became a whisper among the inmates, a rumor that grew and twisted with each retelling. Some said it was an elaborate escape plan, a tunnel dug beneath the prison that led to freedom. Others spoke of a curse, a malevolent spirit that claimed the souls of the damned. But I knew better than to believe in ghosts or in the possibility of escape. The prison was too well guarded, its walls too thick, and the air too heavy with the weight of despair. It was the night that Tony vanished that the whispers changed. Tony, who had been my cellmate for a few short weeks, was a talker, his voice a constant companion in the otherwise stifling silence. We had shared stories of our pasts, the mistakes that had led us here, and dreams of a future that seemed to drift further away with each passing day. The night he disappeared, I awoke to find his bed empty, the sheets pulled back as if he had simply risen and walked away. The whispers surged then, a crescendo of voices that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. I could feel them pressing against my mind, probing the fragile walls of my sanity. In that moment, I knew they were not mere sounds, but something alive, something that sought to break me down, to draw me into the same abyss that had claimed the others. Days turned into a haze of unease, each moment tinged with the knowledge that I could be next. I began to dread the nights when the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford, for fear that I would drift into unconsciousness and wake to find myself alone, consumed by the darkness. In the daylight, I tried to focus on mundane tasks, clinging to the vestiges of routine like a lifeline. I watched the guards, searching for some sign that they, too, were aware of the growing menace. But they remained impassive, their expressions betraying nothing of the unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. It was during one of these futile attempts at distraction that I found a clue. A piece of the puzzle that, once seen, could not be ignored. I was in the library, a cramped, dusty room that housed a pitiful collection of worn paperbacks and dog-eared magazines. I had taken to spending my afternoons there, seeking refuge in the pages of stories that promised escape, if only for a few hours. On this particular day, I pulled a book from the shelf, its spine cracked and cover faded from years of neglect. As I flipped through the pages, a scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a simple note, written in a hurried scrawl that spoke of desperation. "Please don't let it get me," it read. "I can hear them. They are coming for me." The words sent a chill through my bones, a confirmation of what I had feared. Someone else had heard the whispers, felt their insidious pull. But who had written the note? Was it one of the vanished men? A final plea for help that had gone unanswered? I tucked the note into my pocket, my mind racing with possibilities. If someone else had heard them, then perhaps I was not alone in this nightmare. Perhaps there was a way to fight back, to resist the lure of the whispers before they claimed me as well. That night, I resolved to stay awake, to confront the whispers and learn their true nature. I sat on my bunk, my back pressed against the cold stone wall, and waited for the darkness to descend. The hours stretched interminably, each tick of the clock echoing like a death knell in the silence. As the shadows deepened, the whispers returned, filling the cell with their eerie cadence. I forced myself to listen, to let the sounds wash over me without succumbing to their seductive pull. It was like standing at the edge of a precipice, the void beckoning with promises of oblivion. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into words, phrases that cut through the din like shards of glass. "Join us," they intoned. A siren call that resonated with a primal part of me, a part that longed for release from the relentless grind of existence. "Give yourself to us." In that moment of clarity, I understood. The whispers were not a force to be feared, but an invitation, a call to surrender to whatever lay beyond the veil of reality. They were offering escape, a freedom of sorts, but at what cost? The faces of the vanished men flashed through my mind, their absence a stark reminder of the price of that freedom. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the clamor. "I will not join you." The whispers faltered, a ripple of disbelief passing through their ranks. For a moment, the cell was silent, save for the ragged sound of my breathing. Then, as if in response to my defiance, they surged once more, their voices rising in a cacophony that threatened to drown out my thoughts. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to shut out the noise, to hold on to the fragile thread of my sanity. "I will not join you," I repeated, my voice rising to a shout, a declaration of will against the encroaching darkness. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the whispers fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving behind a stillness that was both comforting and unnerving. I lowered my hands, my pulse pounding in my ears, and listened to the sound of my own breathing echoing in the emptiness. The next day, the mood in the prison was different. An undercurrent of unease rippling through the ranks of the guards and inmates alike. Whispers of another disappearance circulated, but strangely, there was no name attached to this latest vanishing. It was as if the person had been erased, not just from the prison, but from memory itself. I kept the note in my pocket, a talisman against the whispers, a reminder that I was not alone in my struggle. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers remained silent, retreating to whatever shadowed realm they had come from. But the fear lingered, a specter that haunted my thoughts and colored my dreams. I wondered often about the vanished men, about what fate had befallen them after they answered the call of the whispers. Had they found peace, or were they lost, adrift in a void of their own making? The questions gnawed at me, leaving an ache that refused to fade. In the end, it was not the whispers that I feared, but the silence that followed. It was a silence that spoke of loss, of lives extinguished without a trace, and of the fragility of the mind in the face of the unknown. A silence that promised solitude, and with it, a freedom that I could never truly embrace. For though the whispers were gone, their legacy remained, a lingering fear, a shadow cast over the thin veneer of normalcy that I clung to in this place of stone and steel. And as I lay in my cell at night, staring into the darkness, I knew that the struggle was far from over. The whispers might have retreated, but the prison itself was a living thing, its walls alive with secrets that waited patiently to be revealed.